Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey guys, this is episode 2 with Detective Lindsey Wade from the Tacoma Police Department. Fantastic discussion. Hope you enjoy.
And they generated a complete, in his words, beautiful profile from this crusty blood vial. And so they actually were able to enter that profile into the Florida DNA database, which was fantastic, but it was not going to go into the national DNA database because of CODIS rules. So on one hand, I was super excited that, hey, you found it, it's going in, but wait, stop. No, what do you mean it's not going to go into national? Like, again, he was committing crimes all over the country. It's great that it's in Florida, but we know he committed crimes in other states besides Florida because he was not a convicted offender at the time his DNA was collected in Florida. He didn't qualify. And because he was no longer in custody in Florida, his DNA didn't qualify to go into the national database based on the CODIS rules. So I was like, okay, well, I'm not okay with that. we've got to talk to somebody. And so he ended up meeting with the CODIS administrators for ENDIS and the FBI and getting an approval to get Ted Bundy's DNA put into the national DNA database under the legal index. So he actually is not in the offender index, he's in the legal, but that's just semantics. It doesn't really matter at this point because his DNA is still searching against crime scene evidence that comes up into the national database from all the other states. So long story short.
Yeah, no, that is so interesting. That's insane. It's like, who cares if it's the offender? I mean, it's still searchable, right?
It is searchable. And I guess, the one thing that this did for me, it opened my eyes to this reality that we have literally thousands of convicted murderers and rapists in our country that are not in CODIS. And once I kind of stumbled upon this, I started finding examples of this left and right, not just in Washington, but all over the country. And now, as a result of a lot of lobbying by Angela Williamson at the Department of Justice, we actually have federal funding available through the Sexual Assault Kit Initiative to go for agencies, law enforcement agencies, to go out and collect DNA samples from these convicted offenders who should be in CODIS, but who slip through the cracks. And I mean, I can name off, a dozen cases off the top of my head of guys that were sitting in prison for decades that never had their DNA collected because they went in before the DNA laws took effect. And finally, when their DNA is collected, they hit to multiple cold cases. Guys that were executed, serial killers that died in prison or who were executed that never had their DNA collected. I mean, these guys are the guys that are the prime suspects in the era of serial killing, from the 70s, late 60s, 1970s, and into the 80s. And these are the guys that are not in there because, they've either died or, they just somehow slipped through the cracks. So I'm so happy to see that law enforcement agencies around the country are finally recognizing that this is an issue and they're taking steps to collect these DNA samples to solve cold cases.
Yeah, that's so amazing.
Yeah, so I just think for anyone in the field who's listening to this, anyone in the criminal justice field that has anything to do with working on cases, especially cold cases, I would challenge you to ask the question in your area, in your state or your jurisdiction. What do you know about DNA collection from convicted offenders? Because I can pretty much guarantee that if you start looking into it, you will be completely shocked and horrified by the gaps in the system. As I mentioned earlier, there are, all kinds of examples of offenders around the country who literally have slipped through the cracks, who committed atrocious murders and sexual assaults, and, serial offenders. And, some of these have come to light because of genetic genealogy cases that have been solved. And in other cases, they've come to light for, other reasons, like, the offender getting transferred to a different facility, things of that nature. But the bottom line is pretty much every state has the same issues, and that is an inconsistent methodology when it comes to collecting DNA from convicted offenders. Whether it's people who walk right out of the courtroom after getting sentenced for, a felony or some other crime that requires DNA collection, and they never report to wherever they need to report to give their DNA, or, somebody who, never gets their DNA collected when they're in jail or prison, or, where they were incarcerated. So, it is a huge problem, and it's really a difficult problem to get a handle on. When I was working at the Attorney General's office, we did have that sexual assault kit initiative grant that addressed collecting DNA from convicted offenders. And so that's something that's still going on in Washington State currently, trying to get a handle on just how many there are, and then coming up with ways to get the DNA collected. And of course, trying to do all of this in the middle of a global pandemic, which has been quite a challenge.
It's so interesting, though, that when you think about how DNA has been around since the mid-90s, and CODIS has been around for a long time. And, you can't be the first detective that has actually addressed this and all the way up to the FBI and said, you know what, it would be a really good idea if we would have a more robust national database. And if they're convicted felons, they're supposed to be in there anyway. We're throwing money around like it's water up in Washington, D.C. You'd think some of it could get allocated. I mean, we're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine, which is great. But at the same time, when we have a relatively simple process, it wouldn't take billions of dollars to remedy. It's like, why don't we have a robust DNA database? And it's like, to me, it seems like nobody really has this real sense of urgency to make sure that that's complete. And yet there's hundreds of thousands of cold case homicides, let alone, sexual assaults and other lesser crimes, if you will. But even assault with a deadly weapon and sexual assaults, especially, to me, are just so heinous that if you're a convicted sex offender and your DNA isn't in the CODIS database, that's just criminal to me. Yeah,
it's absolutely frightening, but it absolutely is the case. I don't know, like I said, there's too many cases to even count examples of this occurring, but you could do a whole separate episode just on lawfully owed DNA, because it really is frightening. And I think the reason that maybe there hasn't been as much attention placed on this issue is because there's a sense of expectation by the public, and I think a lot of people within the criminal justice system, that, well, CODIS has been around forever, so of course these people are in there. And I don't think people don't really understand how CODIS works. They don't understand the different levels of CODIS. They don't understand that, even though a DNA sample might be in a state database, it doesn't mean it's in the national database. And how does that affect your case and solvability and, searching parameters? I mean, there are a lot of really intricate details that most, people within law enforcement are just not educated on. So I think it's so far into the weeds for most people that they would never even consider it.
Well, can you summarize those really quick?
Really quick.
Is it so detailed that it takes like a PhD to figure it out?
Well, the problem is that every state has their own DNA law. So what might get you into CODIS in Washington may not be the same in Utah. So
that doesn't make any sense. I mean, why isn't the national database standard throughout?
Because every state has their own DNA database, and every state determines the quality and the number of core loci required on any particular evidence sample or any convicted offender sample that is the threshold to be entered into that database. And in the state databases, the threshold is oftentimes lower to be entered into the state than in the national level. So with that being said, that means you could have, let's give an example. You could have a rape homicide case that occurs here in Washington state, and maybe it's a cold case. And so the DNA is somewhat degraded, and maybe they only have, 6 core loci that they've identified from the crime scene evidence. It's enough to put it into the state database, but that's not enough to go into national. So that evidence sample is not going to be searching at the national level against that convicted offender that might have committed the crime who lives in New Hampshire, whose DNA might have been collected in New Hampshire and put into the state and the national database. But because that evidence sample only sits at the state database, it's never going to hit on the Washington case. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think most of my listeners understand. I mean, we've gone over DNA, multiple times, but just so people know, first of all, a loci, what Lindsey's talking about is there are basically 24 loci, which is kind of, if you can visualize a heart monitor, the way it's got little blips on there, every time the heart contracts, you have this peak. And so that's kind of the equivalent of what a loci would look like. So if you have a really strong loci, it's like your heartbeat being stronger. And so that peak is a little higher. And there's 24 specific places along the DNA strand that people look at. And that's how the crime lab is able to say, yes, this is Lindsey Wade's DNA versus over here is Jared Bradley's DNA. And the loci and where those blips and where those peaks are going to be are in very different places. I mean, some might overlap, but for the most part, it's going to be very unique to one individual. And the stronger those peaks, the stronger the profile. And that's where they can get that ratio of, there's one chance in a trillion that it's not Jared Bradley's DNA. As you have more and more loci, then the DNA profile itself is stronger. Therefore, it can be entered and qualify for different databases. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, and I think a lot of people have a general understanding of that, but like you said, there's so many different rules, which is understandable. I mean, you can't just arbitrarily enter somebody's DNA into a database, especially the Constitution protects them from, the illegal searches and seizures. And that's, which is awesome. But at the same time, if they're a convicted felon, let's do what we got to do.
Right. But then that's where the other challenging piece comes in, because every state is different when it comes to which crimes qualify for DNA collection, not only the crime type, but also the year the crime was committed. So as an example, in Washington state, the first DNA law took effect July 1st, 1990, and that was only for violent offenses and sexual offenses. So it was a very small number of crimes that qualified for DNA collections. Basically, it was violent felonies and sex crimes. And then, over the years, the DNA law has been expanded. So when you're looking to figure out who actually owes DNA, you literally have to go line by line on criminal history for each person and figure out, okay, this crime, even though it qualifies for DNA collection today, did it actually qualify for DNA collection at the time the person was convicted for that crime? Because 2002 was when all felonies became DNA qualifying offenses in Washington state. And then Washington also, I think we're up to like 13 gross misdemeanors that require DNA collection upon conviction. But that has been, as various legislative sessions and different laws have gone into effect, those laws have changed. But you have to be very careful to look at the year of the conviction and the actual date of the conviction. You can't just say, yep, if you were ever convicted of, whatever the crime was, stalking, harassment, voyeurism, there's indecent exposure. We just got that one added a couple of years ago. You can't say, well, if you got convicted of indecent exposure in 2005, your DNA can go in, because it can't. It only, counts if it was, since the new law took effect in 2019. So it is very complicated. And when, your average detective is looking at somebody's criminal history, they might see that the person was convicted of all kinds of crimes and think, gosh, this person's DNA, should be in CODIS because they've been convicted of like murder and, rape and stuff, but they may not be in CODIS. And also, when you review criminal histories, there are very few states that put the DNA status of someone on their criminal history. So it takes a lot of legwork to then contact your state CODIS administrator, if you even know who that is, and find out, this is my person, and can you confirm whether or not their DNA is in CODIS?
So based on that, how many detectives do you think really, well, let me backtrack. So a lot of the detectives that I have met kind of defer everything DNA to some of it, they just kind of defer to the crime scene investigators, but most of it, they just kind of defer to the lab. And I have found that a lot of lab people are fantastic. They not only truly want to help and truly want to help the detectives solve the crime, but some are just kind of like, you know what, I'm here to do my job, and I work 9 to 5, and then I go home, and they have such a huge backlog anyway, that doing extra things like what you're talking about, it's not that they won't do it, but some of them just don't take the initiative really to go about and proactively work and with the detectives to help solve some of these crimes. Have you ever run into that?
Yeah, it's not really their job to do that. So and based on the things that you just said, I would find it highly unusual for someone at the lab to like call up a detective and say, hey, let's resubmit the evidence on your case, because we've got some new technology or whatever. That's very rare, because they are slammed and they're completely overworked and overwhelmed, and they have few resources, and especially with the sexual assault kit reform that's occurred across the country, most crime labs are just inundated with the sexual assault kit backlog. So even trying to keep up with their day-to-day cases that are coming in, it's extremely difficult, and they're woefully understaffed.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's amazing. That, in fact, I think the same kind of public uproar that occurred once the news started hitting that there were thousands of sexual assault kits just sitting on shelves that had gone untested for years. I think that same, if people really knew the status of our crime labs, and kind of like you said, the underfunding, and I think the entire justice system as a whole, compared to the billions of dollars and just obscene amount of money that we throw at some of the other social programs, the fact that we have labs that have years of backlog, I think if the public really knew, the same kind of uproar that would happen with those sexual assault kits would happen, everywhere, and then the proper amount of funding would get allocated. And maybe this is the start of something. We ought to start contacting our congressmen and women and saying, hey, get some of these crime labs and police departments the funding that they need so that they can solve these cases. And it's, when I've had multiple episodes where I've talked about the fact that there's 230,000 cold case homicides that are unsolved. And most people have no idea that is a crazy number. And then you extrapolate that out to the fact that if none of those are real serial killings, then that's the possibility that there's 230,000 unconvicted murderers walking the streets. That's when people go oh my gosh, really? Yeah,
I know. And with the sexual assault kits being tested and, looking at the stats and the numbers coming out of the National Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, you can see that the numbers are still relatively slim for the number of cases that produce a CODIS hit. And so then it begs the question, why, for the cases that do produce a DNA profile that is suitable and eligible to be entered into CODIS with no hit, what happens to those cases? And why is there no hit? Now, there may be no hit because the person that committed the crime truly never got convicted of any qualifying offense, or it could be that they slipped through the cracks and their DNA was never collected as it should have been.
Right.
So, but you don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing is people need to understand, in order to make a match, you have to have two DNA profiles, one from the evidence and one from the individual. And I think what you're talking about is a lot of the times, especially when you have all these convicted felons that are sitting in prison and or died or whatever, that never got entered into the database. When you develop a good profile from the evidence, you then have to have something to compare it to. And if the DNA isn't collected from all these guys that are sitting in prison, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but it has to be fairly high of, it's not like one crime, one individual. The majority of crime is being committed, if I could talk this morning, by a relatively small amount of the population. And you can, so in your experience, how many crimes did one individual, on average, I don't know if you even have ever even thought about this, but if you thought of say homicides that you've investigated, how many of those homicides were actually committed by the same person?
Few. I mean, when you're talking about more serious crime, in my personal experience, I had very few where I had multiple offenders linked, or one offender linked to multiple homicides. But with sex crimes, it was a little more common to have one offender linked to multiple sex crimes. And of course, it's also very common to have, one offender linked to a homicide, but has convictions for, multiple convictions for property crimes, drug possession and burglaries. Those are very common. In fact, most of the DNA hits that are made, at least in Washington, to murder and rape cases, they come from offenders that got into the database because their DNA was collected for a nonviolent crime, like a drug offense or a property crime.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.